On today's World Insight, a way to work together despite differences towards stable China-U.S. relations. That's a key takeaway as the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan winds up his 3-day visit to China. So what does the visit tell us about the priorities in the relationship? What's next for relations?
Welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Thursday in Beijing. Xi pointed out that China and the U.S. should be the world's source of stability, peace, and shared growth. And China is quite committed to steady and sustainable China-U.S. relations. In Sullivan's earlier meeting with China's top diplomat Wang Yi, the two talked about a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues, including new talks between the two countries' presidents in the near future. I was at the press briefing by the U.S. National Security Advisor, and here is my take from that specific occasion. For the very first time in 8 years, a U.S. National Security Advisor faced the media in Beijing. It's Jake Sullivan's very first presser in China, just a few months before the Biden administration wraps up. What journalists are most interested in was not about the past, but the future. What he thinks about the future direction of U.S. policy on China.
So I wonder, since the San Francisco summit, more than 20 communication mechanisms have been established or assumed, maintaining the momentum of ongoing dialogue between the two countries. So following this visit, what will be the key focus of the U.S. diplomacy towards China through next January?
I'd like to ask you, talk about a call between the two leaders within the coming weeks. Will there be a last meeting between President Biden and President Xi?
The reason for the International Press Corps to be highly curious about what would happen with and after the U.S. elections is not hard to understand. U.S. politics, many analysts say, has become one of the most unpredictable factors on many crucial issues, which certainly include the relations between China and the U.S. China has been holding on to the long-standing principle of not interfering in others' internal affairs, which of course includes the U.S. elections. But one could sense China's concerns as to whether U.S. elections and the changes thereafter would once again put bilateral relations dangling in the air. This apprehension can be felt even between the lines of the Chinese readout on Chinese president's meeting with Sullivan in Beijing on Thursday. President Xi pointed out that China's U.S. policy is highly consistent. President Xi expressed the hope that the U.S. will work in the same direction with China to maintain the stability of China-U.S. relations. Despite Washington's economic and political machinations to apparently contain China under both the Trump and Biden administrations, China's desire for stability, both in relations with the U.S. and in the broader international system, remains strong. That has been demonstrated by China's keen and persistent efforts toward official dialogue mechanisms under both U.S. administrations, when earlier mechanisms broke down, and China's unfazed in consistently laying down the groundwork for better intergovernmental and even intermilitary communications with the U.S. For example, the quiet talks between China's top diplomat Wang Yi and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan over the past 16 months, according to the latest reports. China has also shown its commitment in keeping high-level interactions with the Chinese president meets in person with top visiting U.S. government representatives on many occasions. Not to mention China's sincerity in seeking to raise people-to-people relations with an invite to 50,000 young people from the U.S. to China. Of course, it takes two to tango. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also acknowledged the significance before the end of his presser in Beijing over the past 4 years just how crucial these official dialogues and direct interactions are. Candid, substantive, and constructive. Those are the words used by both sides to describe the meetings in Beijing this time. One can only hope they will go on to be the key words for official dialogues between China and the U.S. as those conversations continue. Both sides announced they are looking to future interactions on climate change, artificial intelligence, anti-narcotics, military to military, and particularly direct interactions between the two presidents, whether on the phone or in person. For more on China-U.S. relations, we are joined in Shanghai, Wu Xinbo, director of the Center for American Studies with Fudan University. In Maine, U.S., Susan Thornton, senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center of Yale Law School and former acting assistant secretary of the U.S. State Department for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And also in Washington, D.C., Surabh Gupta, senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we see a series of meetings by the U.S. National Security Advisor when he traveled in Beijing. Now, to you, Susan, what do you think are the most important takeaways for the U.S. side?
You know, the first National Security Advisor visit to Beijing in 8 years is, of course, extremely consequential. And we've seen throughout U.S.-China relations that having a high-level strategic and deep conversation between the U.S. and China is crucial to maintaining stability, mutual understanding, and avoiding mistakes in the relationship and crises in the relationship. So I think it's very important that Jake went to Beijing, and I think what we see from that is that we've been able to sort of open up some other areas of communication.
Professor Wu, to you, what is the most important takeaways from the Chinese side?
From a Chinese side, I think the most important thing is that we have this important dialogue and meetings in a time when the U.S. is going to enter the presidential election and then the power transition to the next administration. So this trip by Jake Sullivan to Beijing somehow get two sides to prepare for the next several months, which will need some extra attention to manage this relationship. And there will be some challenges we have to confront, as we can say, down the road. So in that sense, I think this is an important time and important visit.
Let's come through some of the issues. First of all, there is the new development of mill-to-mill relations. There's likely going to be some phone conversations between the two militaries. At this time, the National Security Advisor from the U.S. also met with the Chinese officials in charge of the issue. So, Surabh, tell me more as to the security issue for the rest of the Biden administration. What can Washington do in order to avoid any crisis?
I think it's very good that the two sides are talking, in the two militaries are talking. The institutional mechanisms that they have in terms of their talks have been restarted, and those conversations are ongoing. The important part out here is that the militaries are speaking. The civilian heads oftentimes don't have mechanisms where they coordinate with each other. That we have a civilian head, a very important civilian official at the U.S. side speaking to number two at the Chinese side. I think it's a very stabilizing development.
What are the issues, Susan, you are looking at in terms of mill-to-mill?
Well, what I hope to see, frankly, Tianwei, is the establishment of this commander level communication. I think it was spoken about by both sides, and it was one of the commitments from the Woodside Summit, because the militaries, frankly, are very devoted and focused on their mission. So when we have, as Professor Wu Xinbo mentioned, political transitions and political changes, the military is a very kind of steady and focused organization and very pragmatic. And so, as things may develop, in the political sphere, militaries talking to each other can continue their kind of stabilizing communications and make sure that there are no missed signals or misunderstandings. And so I think certainly the issues that we've seen recently around the South China Sea with various incidents between China and the Philippines at various features, there have been conversations about incursions into various countries, ADIZs and territorial waters and air spaces. And I think those kinds of things we need to make sure there's a way to communicate about those things and handle them so there's no unintended incidents.
Professor Wu.
Well, let's not exaggerate the importance of meal-to-meal relations at the moment. I mean, meal-to-meal relations, they have to be handled in the context of overall relationship, which is now featured by constant friction and the lack of mutual trust. So even though we can have this dialogue and meetings between two militaries, but still, I think the mutual mistrust is very high, and there are always frictions either in the sea or in the air between two militaries. So to some extent, meal-to-meal relations only make sense when two sides want to avoid accidental crisis. So in that sense, that can help at the tactical level, but at the strategic level, I don't think this meal-to-meal relations can make any difference in this relationship.
In the conversations between the two sides, once and again, the importance of existing mechanism to continue, particularly regarding the dialogues between the two sides, whether it's financial issues, a security issue, or strategic issues. When I was at the presser given by National Security Advisor Sullivan, many of the journalists asked repeatedly about the question as to what the future might be from Washington regarding China-U.S. relations. People are afraid that there's going to be a lack of consistency as a result leading up to the election and afterwards. So, Susan, your thoughts on that? Ms. Thornton.
Of course, a lot will depend on the results of the election, but I think no matter what the result is, both of the candidates have experience in dealing with China, obviously. To some extent, presidential transitions in the United States are always very difficult on U.S.-China relations because there are a lot of issues and some of them are quite sensitive and complicated. But maybe an advantage we have here is that both of the candidates do have experience in dealing with this relationship. And I think, the trajectory of U.S.-China relations is going to continue to be, as my Professor Wu Xinbo said, difficult, and there are a lot of challenges and a lot of frictions. So we can expect those to continue. But the main important thing is to keep the communication going. Don't lose so much trust between the two of us that we stop this communication channel and stop talking to one another. That's the most important thing in my view.
Mr. Gupta, we noticed in the readout by the Chinese side regarding Chinese President Xi Jinping's meeting with the U.S. National Security Advisor, one of the important points he emphasized is also consistency. He emphasized on China's consistency in approaching China-U.S. relations. What do you think exactly he meant? And how is that message likely to be received by Washington?
I think where he's getting at is that each administration should not be reinventing the wheel with regard to U.S.-China relations, particularly in terms of, as we are talking, dialogue mechanisms, communication channels. There used to be this vast overarching dialogue mechanisms during the Clinton era and after that, during the Bush administration, Obama administration. And then, I mean, all that overarching framework collapsed. And what we saw in the Trump years and what we've seen out here are more ad hoc dialogue mechanisms. But while those Trump era dialogue mechanisms did not continue, what we do see now is that these dialogue mechanisms in the Biden term have been deepened, are very rich, and have been widened, and create a new framework per se, which is much more flexible and supple, I would say, in terms of dialogue and conversation channels. So, but I think where President Xi is getting at is that each administration comes in with its new views on China, and then it rejiggers everything, and that creates a lot of flux in the relationship, and that can also create danger in the relationship because there's continuity of channels. And he would like to see it on a much more stabler path so that it's more predictable, and people can and both parties can move forward on the basis of more stabler interactions, frankly.
How much China hope that will be consistent, Professor Wu, and how is China preparing for different options or different scenarios?
We always have to prepare for different scenarios. I mean, what we hope for is very clear. We want to see a cooperative and a constructive relationship with the U.S. Now, with the U.S. entering another cycle of political election, so the new administration in Washington may have a somewhat different China policy. However, if in the next several months, China-U.S. can work together to manage this relationship in a very challenging period, and some good legacy, no matter it's a Republican administration or Democratic administration. I mean, this kind of cooperation solves the interests of both sides. So in that sense, while we are, working to prepare for different scenarios, we should also seize the opportunity to work with the Biden administration to make sure that in the next several months, bilateral relations are generally stable and predictable.
The words used by the two sides. From the Chinese president in the Chinese readout, he's talking about the two countries should figure out a way, especially asking the U.S. to join China to figure out a way to have two major powers get along. Well, the U.S. side from the National Security Advisor has been emphasizing on sustainable relations between China and the United States, did not necessarily spell out as to what does sustainable mean. Is it sustainable for the right direction, to the positive direction, get along direction, or to the other directions? That seems to be quite interesting, even though only through words. Mr. Gupta, your thoughts?
Yeah, on this issue of strategic perception, I'm afraid I think that gap is not going to be narrowed because the U.S. is very clear going forward as to how it's going to manage its relationship with China. They've kind of flipped the script. It used to be the U.S. and China used to engage each other, but also compete with each other. Right now, the way the U.S. looks at it is in terms of pure competition, and trying to find out areas within that competitive framework where they can also cooperate. And I don't think that framework is going to change. And I know President Xi has talked about, the first button off the shirt needs to be buttoned correctly. Otherwise, you're never going to get that shirt. You're not going to wear the shirt correctly. But I'm afraid I don't think on that front there is going to be the change. China will look to have that relationship, a cooperative relationship in which they compete in a healthy way. But that's not the way the U.S. is looking at it. And the U.S., what is in fact trying to do is to ensure that competition, as we've talked about previously, does not spiral into rivalry, and therefore that certain bit of reassurance is provided by the Sullivans and through these communication and dialogue channels to try to keep it on an even keel, to maintain a floor beneath which the relationship will not sink. But I think the upside of the relationship is capped. And I'm afraid that if the Republicans come back into power, the downside could be really bottomless. And therefore, let's try to make the best of what we have right now in terms of whether it's framing it in terms of cooperation or competition, but to find actual areas where the two sides can cooperate for both for their own good, for the good of the region, and for the international system.
Ms. Thornton, how do you understand, even from the words the two sides use? One is get along, the other is quote unquote sustainable, especially when you look at one after another areas that the media has been focusing on, for example, so-called overcapacity dispute between China and the United States, semiconductors, AI's future, and etc. Certainly the Taiwan issue, South China Sea, and the list goes on.
Well, I do think that there is a difference in the two words that you mentioned, get along and sustainable. But what I'm focused on is the areas where the U.S. and China were in agreement in their readouts. So they both said that the discussions were candid, substantive, and constructive. And I like the word constructive. I hope that both countries will be constructive because the world needs them to be. And, you know, we do see elements of the rivalry that are becoming lose-lose kind of competition, which to my mind is not the right way to approach the problems. And I hope that we can get away from that. Right. What I'm worried about, frankly, is a growing kind of perception, I think both in China and the U.S., that the two sides are just going to go their separate ways. That kind of evolution is going to be extremely deleterious to both countries and to the world. And so when I think about sustainability, what I hope it's aimed at is keeping, you know, an integrated global system that will actually benefit both countries more, but also the rest of the world.
Both sides mentioned about the future interactions before January. What do you think can be the best opportunities for both sides to once again look at some of the priorities for cooperation, hopefully, and discuss more in detail some of the controversial issues to avoid the crisis before the new administration comes to Washington? Mr. Gupta.
There are two elements out here. One is the crisis element, and one is the continuity of the various dialogue channels element. You know, let me talk in terms of the continuity. You know, that process began with the Bali consensus at the G20 in Indonesia in November 2022. And it was interrupted by the balloon incident, but thereafter the two sides were able to pick up the pieces, and they've moved forward consistently, widen that conversation. I would suggest that in the next few months, we're also going to have, I think John Podesta is going to go to Beijing, so there are going to be conversations on the climate change issue also. So my view would be, let's move forward consistently on all these topics, counter-narcotics, climate change, and et cetera, where they have made very good, useful strides and are moving forward. And hopefully that if a Democratic administration is re-elected, Ms. Harris is re-elected, that there will be continuity with this, with these dialogue channels. And I think that would be very stabilizing for the relationship. With regard to crisis communications, I think it's been very useful that Jake Sullivan met the vice chair of the CMC. As I said, there are mill channels, but there are not great civilians to civilian channels in dealing with crises. This might provide a framework, or at least a beginning, where the U.S. side and the Chinese side have their interlocutors ready in case at the time of a transition, if a crisis were to arise. Any movement in that direction in terms of deepening those conversations is always welcome. And so it's useful to have these conversations and dialogue channels ready so that phones can be picked up at short notice.
Ms. Thornton, tell me more about your thoughts as to how is this likely to lead up to the coming January?
Well, I think we can keep things fairly stable and continue the communications. As you said, John Podesta is going to be coming to Beijing. I think you'll see a continuation of various working groups that have been set up already. We had the finance working group already in Beijing this month, and there'll be more of those meetings at a working level to hammer out, especially on the economic side, some of the issues. But I do think the economic portfolio is the one that needs the most interaction and the most work. And certainly that'll be the area that President Trump himself, if he is elected, would be focused on. But I think both candidates need to take up in a more serious way a discussion of, the future of the economic relationship between the U.S. and China, and how to manage it in the sort of global economy and with other partners. I certainly think technology, the future of technology, how we manage that is an incredibly important topic. The two sides have started. They've had their first AI dialogue, quote unquote, but they need to do a lot more work in order to get that conversation to be more meaningful and actually more productive to handle this issue.
Professor Wu, your thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, let's not be too ambitious, because Biden is entering the last phase of his tenure. As a university professor, I would like to say some actions taken in promoting people-to-people exchanges between two sides. Especially, I would like to say the bilateral science and technology cooperation agreement be renewed and for another 5 years. If that can happen, I think that will be a great news for people-to-people exchanges. And also some more actions can be taken to facilitate the exchanges between two sides. So after all, the basis for this relationship are the people, the common people from both sides. And these issues are less sensitive, not highly political. So if Biden really wants to leave some good legacy for this relationship, he should think about doing that. That's my advice for him.
Wu Xinbo, Susan Thornton, Surab Gupta, thank you so much for joining us. All the best. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.